It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas night. December 24, 1945. Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family had just finished celebrating. Laughter still lingered in the house as the children slowly went to bed. Outside, the town was calm. No storms. No chaos. Just cold winter air and silence. Then, just after midnight, everything changed. A phone rang. Jenny Sodder picked it up. On the other end was a woman she didn't recognize. The voice sounded strange. She asked for someone Jenny had never heard of. In the background, there was laughter. Then the line went dead. Minutes later, Jenny heard a loud thump on the roof. She assumed it was something falling from a tree. Maybe a branch. Maybe nothing at all. She went back to sleep. Less than an hour later, the smell of smoke filled the house. By the time the Sodders realized what was happening, flames were already climbing the walls. George Sodder rushed to get his children out. He grabbed the youngest. Jenny followed, screaming names into the smoke. 5 children made it outside. 5 did not. The Sodders tried everything. George ran back inside but was forced out by the heat. He grabbed a ladder usually kept against the house. It was gone. He tried to use his trucks to reach the upper windows. Both failed to start. Tools that worked perfectly the day before suddenly didn't. Within minutes, the house collapsed. The fire burned itself out by morning. When the ashes cooled, officials searched the ruins. They found no bones, no remains, no trace of 5 children. Authorities quickly gave their conclusion. The children had died in the fire. Their bodies had been completely cremated by the heat. But George and Jenny knew something was wrong. They had lived in that house for years. They had seen fires before. They knew what fire could and could not do. And this fire didn't make sense. Neighbors later reported seeing strange things that night. A man watching the house burn. A car parked nearby with unfamiliar faces. Objects thrown onto the roof shortly before the fire began. Then came the most disturbing detail. The Sodders were told the fire wasn't hot enough to completely destroy human bones. Yet no remains were found. Not a single fragment. That Christmas night didn't just take a house. It erased 5 children and left behind a mystery that would haunt America for decades. And the deeper the Sodders searched for answers, the more unsettling the truth became. From the very beginning, the fire didn't behave like a normal fire. Investigators claimed it was an electrical accident. A faulty wire. A simple explanation meant to close the case quickly. But George Sodder refused to accept it. He knew his house. Just weeks earlier, an electrician had inspected the wiring and found nothing wrong. No warnings. No hazards. Nothing that could cause such a sudden, violent blaze. And then there were the details no one could explain. The fire started in the middle of the night, but it spread with terrifying speed. Faster than house fires usually do. Flames climbed upward instead of spreading slowly room by room. The roof collapsed far sooner than expected. Firefighters didn't arrive until hours later. The Sodders had tried to call for help, but the phone line was dead. Later, it was discovered the line had been cut, not damaged by fire, but physically severed. That alone raised serious questions. Then there were the missing tools. The ladder that George always kept beside the house had vanished. It was later found hidden in a ditch nearby. His 2 trucks, which normally started without issue, refused to turn over that night. Both worked perfectly again the next morning. Coincidence or interference? As investigators sifted through the ashes, they expected to find at least something. Even in intense fires, bones remain. Teeth survive. Metal buttons melt but leave residue. Yet the search turned up nothing. Officials insisted the fire had burned hot enough to cremate the children completely. That statement didn't hold up. Experts later confirmed that even crematoriums require temperatures much higher, sustained for hours, to reduce a body entirely to ash. The Sodder house burned for less than an hour. The math didn't work. Adding to the confusion, neighbors came forward with disturbing reports. One witness claimed to see someone throwing fireballs onto the roof. Another said they saw men watching the fire from a parked car, then driving away as the flames grew. There was also a report of a strange man visiting the Sodders weeks earlier, warning George that his house would burn down. The man allegedly made comments about George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and the Italian government, something that had already caused tension in the community. Was it a threat? Was it a warning? Authorities showed little interest. Within days, the case was closed. 5 children declared dead. No remains. No investigation. But George and Jenny refused to let it end there. They dug through the ashes themselves. They sifted every corner of the property. At one point, George even brought in dirt from another location and spread it over the site, hoping bones might surface later. Nothing did. As the weeks passed, grief turned into suspicion. Because the more they looked at that fire, the clearer it became. This wasn't an accident. It was something else. And whatever happened inside that house that night, it was only the beginning. As days passed, the reality became impossible to ignore. 5 Sodder children were gone. Not missing. Not injured. Not accounted for. Gone. Officials insisted the fire had destroyed them completely. That there was nothing left to find. But George and Jenny couldn't accept that. Parents know when something isn't right. And nothing about this felt right. They demanded answers. Independent experts were consulted. Fire specialists. Forensic examiners. People with no connection to the local authorities. Every one of them said the same thing. A house fire like that could not erase 5 bodies without leaving a trace. Bones should have remained. Teeth. Something. Even in extreme fires, fragments survive. But the Sodder property held nothing. Just ash and silence. Then came a detail that shook the family. A neighbor claimed to have found a human bone in the ashes weeks later. Authorities dismissed it. When it was finally examined, it was identified as an animal bone, placed there intentionally. Someone had tried to plant evidence. Why? The Sodders began to wonder if the fire wasn't meant to kill their children at all. What if it was meant to hide something else? Rumors began to spread. Stories whispered through town. Some said the children had been kidnapped. Others said the fire was a distraction, a way to make 5 children disappear without witnesses. The family learned that earlier that night, a woman had been seen watching the house from the road. Another witness claimed they saw children in a car being driven away during the fire. Authorities ignored these reports. The case was officially closed. But the Sodders refused to move on. They placed a large billboard along the highway, offering a reward for information. It featured photos of the missing children and a simple question. What happened to our children? Years passed. The billboard stayed. The Sodders aged. And still, no answers. But then something happened that changed everything. Years later, Jenny Sodder received a letter from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man. On the back, a handwritten note read, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illil boys." A 90132. Louis Sodder was one of the missing children. The man in the photo looked older, but the resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes. Same face structure. Same expression. The Sodders were stunned. They sent the photo to the FBI. The FBI confirmed the man looked similar, then dropped the investigation. No follow-up. No explanation. The case quietly disappeared again. But the damage was done. The idea that the children may have survived was no longer impossible. It was terrifying. Because if they survived, who took them? Why? And how did 5 children vanish so completely, leaving behind nothing but smoke and questions? The deeper the Sodders searched, the more the case stopped looking like a tragedy and started looking like a crime. Years after the fire, the Sodder case refused to stay quiet. Evidence kept appearing, the kind of evidence that shouldn't exist if the official story were true. One of the most unsettling details involved the house itself. When the Sodders rebuilt on the same land, workers digging the foundation expected to find remnants of the old structure. Charred beams, melted metal, maybe even human remains. They found none. Instead, they uncovered something strange. The soil beneath the house had been deliberately disturbed. Layers of dirt appeared moved, as if someone had filled or covered something intentionally. Not by accident. By design. Then there were the witnesses. One woman came forward years later claiming she saw the missing Sodder children at a roadside diner in the early morning hours after the fire. They were traveling with 2 adults who looked hostile. When she tried to speak to the children, the adults shut her down. Another witness, a motel worker, reported seeing children matching the Sodders' descriptions in the days following the fire. She remembered them because they were nervous, quiet, and closely watched. Authorities dismissed these stories. But the Sodders didn't. They noticed a pattern. Every lead suggested the same thing. The children were alive after the fire. Then there was the matter of the ladder. George Sodder eventually found it, not burned, not broken, but hidden in a nearby embankment. Someone had moved it. Someone had made sure George couldn't use it that night. And the phone line? Cut clean through. Not melted. Not damaged by fire. Cat. Each of these details alone might be explained away. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. The fire wasn't random. The obstacles weren't accidents. The disappearance wasn't natural. It looked planned. Even more unsettling was a detail involving the local coroner. He claimed to have found human remains in the ashes. Later, it was revealed the remains were never from the fire at all. They were taken from a cemetery and planted. Why would anyone do that? To close the case. To force an ending. To stop questions. But the Sodders wouldn't stop. They hired private investigators. Some disappeared. Others reported being followed. One investigator claimed to have identified suspects and then vanished without explanation. The case grew cold. But it never went silent. Because evidence kept surfacing, not physical proof, but contradictions. Gaps. Lies that didn't hold up under time. And every new detail pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The fire was a cover. And whatever happened to the Sodder children was something someone desperately wanted forgotten. Most families are told to grieve. George and Jenny Sodder were told to forget. From the moment officials declared their children dead, pressure began to move on. Close the case. Accept the loss. Rebuild. Let time do the rest. They refused. Because parents don't abandon questions when their children vanish without proof. George Sodder became obsessed with details. He replayed that night over and over in his mind. The phone call. The thump on the roof. The missing ladder. The trucks that wouldn't start. The cut phone line. Too many things had gone wrong. Too many at the same time. Jenny held on to something else. Hope. She refused to wear black for the rest of her life. She said she would only wear mourning clothes when she knew her children were truly dead. Until then, she would wait. That decision lasted decades. The Sodders didn't trust local authorities, so they took matters into their own hands. They contacted fire experts, forensic specialists, private investigators, anyone willing to look at the case with fresh eyes. Every expert told them the same thing. The fire could not have destroyed 5 bodies completely. And that was enough. They placed a massive billboard along US Route 60 near their home. It displayed photos of the missing children and offered a reward for information. Thousands of people saw it every day. Some stopped. Some called. Some whispered. Leads came in from all over the country. Most went nowhere. But a few were impossible to ignore. Reports of children resembling the Sodders appeared in multiple states. Sightings in buses, in restaurants, in towns far from West Virginia. Always with adults. Always guarded. Always gone before anyone could intervene. The Sodders chased every lead. They spent their savings. They traveled. They asked questions people didn't like being asked. And the harder they pushed, the more resistance they met. Officials dismissed them as grieving parents unable to let go. Neighbors stopped talking. Investigators backed out. Doors closed quietly. But George noticed something disturbing. People weren't just uninterested. They were uncomfortable. As if continuing the investigation made others nervous. One private investigator told George he had identified the people responsible for the fire and abduction. He said the children were taken and placed with families sympathetic to a foreign political group. Then the investigator disappeared. No report. No conclusion. No explanation. After that, the Sodders were alone. But they didn't stop believing. Years passed. Their remaining children grew older. Some began to doubt. Others stayed convinced their siblings were alive somewhere. And then came the photograph. A single image. A single name. And suddenly, hope wasn't just emotional. It felt real. Because if even one child survived, then the official story collapsed completely. For years, the Sodders lived between grief and belief. They didn't claim certainty. They claimed possibility. And that possibility was fueled by sightings that refused to stop. Reports came from places far from West Virginia. People swore they had seen children who looked like the missing Sodders. Some described hearing them speak with unfamiliar accents. Others noticed they were unusually quiet, always watched closely by adults who refused conversation. Most of these sightings could never be verified. But one detail connected them all. The children were never alone. Then, nearly 20 years after the fire, something arrived in the mail that changed everything. It was an envelope. No return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man standing in front of a brick building. On the back, a handwritten note read, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illil boys." A 90132. Louis Sodder was one of the 5 children believed to have died in the fire. The Sodders stared at the photo in disbelief. The man's face carried unmistakable features. The same eyes. The same shape of the nose. Even the same expression George recognized from his son. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. Jenny was convinced. This was her child. The family immediately contacted authorities. The FBI briefly investigated. They confirmed the resemblance was possible. Then, without explanation, they dropped the case. No follow-up. No identification attempt. No public statement. The photograph vanished into silence. But the Sodders never forgot it. They hired a private investigator to track the photo's origin. The investigator traveled south. He found leads pointing toward Italy. Then communication stopped. The investigator never reported back. Whether he disappeared or chose to walk away was never confirmed. But the message was clear. Someone didn't want this followed. Years later, forensic artists recreated age-progressed images of the missing children. The results were unsettling. Several closely matched reported sightings from decades earlier. And then came another disturbing clue. A woman claimed she overheard men speaking Italian the night of the fire. George had enemies. He was outspoken against Mussolini and the fascist regime. He had argued with members of the local Italian community. Some had warned him his words would bring consequences. Was it coincidence? Or motive? The theory grew darker. What if the children weren't victims of a fire, but of revenge? What if they were taken as punishment? The idea was horrifying, but it explained too much. The sabotage, the silence, the resistance from authorities, the planted evidence. And if the children were taken, raised elsewhere, and told never to return, then the Sodder children didn't vanish. They were erased. And erased people don't leave records. They leave shadows. By the time the Sodder case reached its second decade, it was no longer just a mystery. It was a warning. Because every theory that tried to explain what happened only made the story darker. One of the most discussed theories centers on kidnapping. Not random. Not opportunistic. Targeted. Supporters of this theory believe the fire was staged to create chaos and cover. While George and Jenny fought the flames and panic took over, the children were taken out another way. Quietly. Quickly. With help from people who knew the house. This theory explains the sabotage. The cut phone line. The missing ladder. The trucks that wouldn't start. It explains why the children were never found in the ashes. But it raises another question. Who would do this? That's where the case turns even darker. George Sodder had been outspoken against Mussolini and the fascist government in Italy. He had arguments with members of the local Italian community. Some had openly warned him that his words would bring trouble. Was the fire retaliation? Some investigators believe the children were taken and distributed among families sympathetic to a foreign political group. Raised under new identities. Told their parents were dead. Told never to return. It sounds extreme. Until you realize how clean the disappearance was. Another theory suggests organized crime involvement. That the children were taken to settle a score or send a message. The lack of official interest. The planted evidence. The pressure to close the case quickly. All signs of influence. Then there is the most painful theory of all. That some people in authority knew what happened and chose not to pursue it. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't want what would come next. Because finding the children would mean admitting the fire wasn't an accident. That lives were stolen. That mistakes were made. That someone failed. And history doesn't like admitting that. Every theory leads back to the same place. The Sodder children didn't die in that fire. They were taken. And if that's true, then the case isn't a tragedy. It's an unsolved crime. One hidden behind ash, time, and silence. And that leaves us with one final question. After decades of questions, one truth remains impossible to escape. The Sodder children were never proven dead. No bones. No remains. No evidence strong enough to close the case with certainty. Only assumptions. And assumptions are not the same as answers. If the children died in the fire, something should have been left behind. Fire destroys much, but it does not erase everything. Especially not 5 bodies. Especially not in a house fire that burned for less than an hour. That fact alone keeps the mystery alive. But the case doesn't survive on absence alone. It survives because of what did exist. The cut phone line. The missing ladder. The disabled trucks. The planted bone. The eyewitness sightings. The photograph. Each piece on its own might be questioned. Together, they tell a story that refuses to stay quiet. A story of preparation. Of interference. Of something planned, not accidental. George and Jenny Sodder died without answers. Jenny never wore black. She waited until the end, believing that somewhere, somehow, her children were alive. And maybe they were. Maybe they grew up under different names. Different families. Different lives. Maybe they were told their parents died in a fire. Or that they were abandoned. Or that returning was dangerous. If so, the Sodder children didn't disappear. They were erased. And erasure is far more terrifying than death. Because it means the truth still exists, somewhere, carried by people who may not even know who they really are. Or maybe the truth died with the last person who knew it. Buried under time. Protected by silence. Lost between fear and power. The mystery of the Sodder children endures because it sits at the edge of certainty. Not solved. Not disproven. Just unanswered. And until undeniable proof is found, until someone comes forward, or records surface, or history breaks its silence, the Sodder children remain what they have always been. Not victims. Not ghosts. But questions. Questions that refuse to disappear.